waving inflatable arm flailing tube man. So when you set out to create a model of a tube man, there's some questions you have to ask yourself. What behavior are we trying to capture? How do we model it? Oh, sorry. How do we model it? I'm going to switch to this. That's what I meant. How do we model it? And then how do we take data? So the first question is, what behavior are we trying to do? Sorry, no it's not. What work has been done on a tube man? So far all that's been done is this dimensionless traffic generating factor, which we can see is proportional to the height of the object, the second power of the degrees of freedom times 10 million times the wavelength of light in feet times the number of Toyotas on the lot divided by the square of the distance from the adjacent road and the number of PT cruisers. I don't know where they got that from, but it's on the internet, so you got it right.
It's called empirical science.
What?
It's called empirical science.
Right. So when we want to model a tube, we have to. You know what? I'm just going to show you how it works. Everybody catch that?
No, take it again.
Okay. So what we have is with the tube man is we have a small disturbance at the bottom, and what's going to happen is it's going to propagate up to the top, and you get this kind of traveling kink behavior. And that's weird. When you have kinks in nature, that's something weird's going on. We don't really know how to simulate that, but we're going to try. Let's watch. So let's take a step back and talk about what's the goal of physics. If you think about every physics problem you've ever done, what it boils down to is we have some initial conditions, and then we want to predict the future state of the system at a later time. Let's take F equals ma for an example. What that really is a prescription for how the velocities change over time. If we know that, then we know the position. And if we can get the forces as a function of the velocities and positions, then we can calculate the next acceleration. We keep leapfrogging through this process until we calculate the trajectory for as long as we care about, or until we get sick of waiting for the computer. So the question is, can we take what we've learned in four-ish years and apply it to a tube man? So if you stare at a tube man for long enough, you might start to see a bunch of pendulum bobs connected together. And we know how to deal with the system. This is the thing we spent a lot of time on. We have the double pendulum. So what we ultimately want to get is a Cartesian vector for each point as a function of time, because we can animate it and analyze it. So we start with F equals ma, because we always do. But then we realize the forces are complicated. When the pendulum swings this way, this bob is going to pull on that one, and we have these forces of constraint we have to deal with, and that gets really complicated really fast. So what we do is we switch to using angles as coordinates, and we use the Lagrangian formula. Now what that's going to do is give us theta double dot is equal to some kind of torque over the moment of inertia. Now the details of the Lagrangian formalism are kind of complicated. The derivation's a little hairy, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. What we get is the equations of motion. We have a second derivative of theta is equal to a torque over a moment of inertia for each of them. Now once we have these, we can feed it into Python, and it's going to step through that leapfrogging process that I was talking about before and give us Cartesian vectors, and then we can animate that. So for a double pendulum, we get something like this.
Does that image have constant energy, or is there energy bleeding out?
There's constant energy, but we'll see in the next one that's not always the case. So it turns out that when you have this equation of motion, you can add an arbitrary torque to this side of the equation. So we have our mechanical torque that we had before, which is just a function of a bunch of stuff, and any arbitrary thing. So in this case, it's nothing physical. I just added some oscillatory stuff just to give you an example that you can generate some really wacky behavior. Now it doesn't have to be useless, and we'll see that that's where the tube man comes from.
Is there a physical reason why you can add that? I'm not seeing.
Yes, but I'm going to continue.
You're going to ignore it.
a double dot for all 10 of them, which is going to be a function of all 10 of the positions, or the angles and the velocity, the angular velocities. The equations are terrible. We skipped it for a double pendulum. We're definitely not going to show it for a 10 pendulum. But luckily we have a symbolic algebra package called SymPy, and it comes to the rescue. What it's going to do is take in the Lagrangian of this system and return a bunch of equations of motion. Now this is the first one. There's 10 of these, and they're terrible, but I don't have to talk about it. I just feed the Lagrangian to the computer, it returns this, and I copy it into my equation solver. So we get a 10 pendulum. So we can see in this case, energy is conserved, and that tells us we're doing something right. This is a time and energy, and we've got a kinetic energy and a gravitational energy. Just kind of swings back and forth. So that's a little bit like a string if there was no air drag, but with a real string, you kind of get this air drag thing, and it stops. Energy is not conserved here. But we can add that external force onto the equation. So in this case, we have some drag torque, which is a function of the Cartesian velocity. That gives us an equation of motion that we can solve in the same way. So here we can see energy is not conserved. It's going to decay down to nothing. Here's the animation. How do we get tubes out of this? Well, the fan's got something to do with what's going on. So we're going to make a momentum argument. If we have a little chunk of air moving up, it's going to have some momentum upward. But then it's going to hit the kink. We know the direction changed because it didn't leave the tube and the angle of the tube has changed. So after a little piece of time, the momentum has changed direction. So we had an initial momentum and a final momentum and a delta momentum. The Newton's second law tells us that a change in momentum over a change in time gives us a force. So there was a force on the air that way, and then Newton's third law tells us that there's an equal and opposite force on the tube that way. Now that force can be interpreted as a torque because we're doing everything at angles. And so there's going to be a torque about some point rotating it up and straightening it out. So we have some torque, which is a function of the density of the air, the cross-sectional area of the tube, and the velocity. But what's really important is the shape of these equations. The first one is a little bit different because it is always referenced to a vertical, but the higher up ones, you can imagine the tube might be bent at an angle, and we still want a torque to be applied here, bending it that way. So what these equations try to do is straighten out each individual position relative to the one under them. Once you have this, you just add it to the right-hand side, and you ask the computer to solve it for you. So now you have a parameter you have to play with, and we don't have a measurement for it, so you kind of just have to guess. So this is too low, and you can see the tube just falls over. But it's trying. You can also make it too high, and then it goes kind of crazy. Then it goes really crazy.
Almost illegal.
Aggressive advertising.
Buy this car.
What's this parameter associated with?
This is the torque. So this is, it's
No.
got,
The one you're adjusting is?
the one I'm adjusting is the torque. So the
Torque of what?
from the momentum argument that we made. So it's got the density of the air and the velocity of the air, and then the cross-section of the tube. So now you go kind of in an in-between zone, and you kind of get in this weird thing where you get an oscillation. So we'll see this kind of looks like a flag a little bit. But there is a traveling kink. It's just not doing it exactly how you would expect. I think it looks like a flag. Not quite a tube in yet. So in addition to the momentum term, there's something going on with the pressure. We think that because when the tube is standing straight up and you poke it, you can feel it's, a certain firmness. And then when it kinks over, you poke it again and you can definitely feel a noticeable difference in pressure. So something's happening with the pressure. We don't know exactly what or how to model it, but something's going on, and we'll talk about later how we're going to figure it out. We think that the pressure should increase with the number of kinks above you. So if it was really bent up, the pressure down here would be really high. So that's basically all we did. We said the pressure at any given point is proportional to all the changes angles above. So it does stuff. Falls, but then once it catches itself, it kind of looks all right, maybe. Maybe not. So you can turn that one up too, and then you can see it really goes crazy. And I think it's trying to pop, but there's no parameter for popping in this, so it doesn't. But it does this. Okay. So what we have is a bunch of parameters that we have to adjust. We have the length of the tube, the gravitational constant, and the mass of the tube. And we can measure all those pretty good. We also have the momentum term, which in principle we could measure pretty well. Velocity of the air is a little tricky, but we could do it. The pressure term's hard to know because we don't even have a model for that. And the drag's a little bit hard to get, but we could get it from the period of oscillation, which we'll get to in a little bit. But basically we have this theta double dot is equal to a bunch of torques on the moment of inertia. The way around this is you have a computer sweep through all the parameters. So you make like a parameter space, and then you sweep through and you look at the output. And then you try and optimize the tubiness. But before we get there, we have to talk about how we know what a real tube does. So how do you take data from a tube? This was kind of a complicated question. You'd think you just film the thing, but if you only have one camera, you miss a lot of information about how this is falling. This almost looks straight up, but then you can see from the second camera angle, it's actually quite knocked over. So what you need is to film two cameras simultaneously, sync up the footage, and then track each of these spots on both cameras, and then combine them in some kind of way to tell what's going on. So tracking was a huge pain, how we did it. We used a program called Tracker. It'd be nice if I just fed it a video and it gave me those dots on it, but you actually have to click individually. It has an auto tracking feature, but it loses it all the time, and it's almost faster to not use it. So there's 10 spots on this times 2 cameras at 15 frames a second is a lot of clicks you have to do. So it took me 10 hours to get 30 seconds of footage, which is just not practical. So we can't do this long term. But it sure is pretty. Okay. So once you get all that data from both cameras, you combine it and you get this animation. So this looks a lot like the animation we had before, but this is real tube data. This came from the camera. And that little thing is because we lost a spot and I had to switch to one on the other side, and I didn't think you'd notice. I didn't think it would work this good, but it actually worked. So now you have all those tube data. You have to ask yourself, how do we measure the tubiness? We need some kind of metric, and we call that a tube metric. So we have several ideas. We don't know which one's going to work. We haven't gotten here yet. But one of them would be to take the time average kinetic energy of each of the spots, and you can kind of imagine the bottom one's not going to be moving very much, while the top one's going to be whipping around. So there's going to be some kind of curve associated with how the energy is going to grow as you look at different ones. And what you can do once you have the data is you can see what the real tube did, and then you can compare that to your model, and you can see how well you did there. There's also a period of oscillation. If you take the velocity of one of them and run a Fourier transform on it, it'll tell you what frequencies are hidden in there, and then you can match your model to that. That'll help put a limit on the damping and driving. The speed of the kink travel would be another way to do it. Once you get a kink in the model, you can watch it go up, and you can see how long it takes. So once you have some kind of tube metrics, and these might not be the optimal ones, but once you come up with them, what you can do is basically run a curve fit. So you have this model that you've made, and you have all these parameters that feed into it, and you ask the computer to change these parameters to optimize the metric to be to optimize the output to look like the real data. And that's not easy to do by hand. Those things I would just get the previous animations, I was guessing numbers basically, and you know, it takes a long time, you gotta run it, you gotta sit there and wait for it to go. But if you could have a computer do it, you just let it run overnight, it would be possible, you could find what you're looking for. So what's next in terms of this project? I got this little chip, it's $10, and it's the same pressure sensor that's in your iPhone. It's a barometric pressure sensor, and what you could do is tape it inside the tube, and you could have several of them going up. And as the kink travels up, you would watch how the pressure changes as a function of time, and that would give you some insight as to what the pressure is doing, because we really don't know, but it's involved. We know it's involved, like I was talking about before. Another thing that would really help would be tracking with computer vision. This is kind of terrifying, and it reminds me of the Terminator, but there's algorithms that are out there, and they're open source through OpenCV or Open Computer Vision. And what you could do is track each individual spot, and they're really robust against the object becoming occluded. So if the tube fell away from the camera, it would know it did that and not give up looking for it and know it's hidden back behind here somewhere, even if you can't see it. That sounds great, but getting it to work is a whole other thing, and we're not quite there yet. But I think that's the way to go. This clicking business is not going to work. Okay, so I worked on this with Dr. Nick Nelson and Kirk Williams. I wanted to thank them. I want to thank Dr. Buchholz for all his contributions. He shares an office with Dr. Nelson, and he was always in our meetings, kind of giving us suggestions, and that was fun. Zydo Wendell for that orange tube. She lent us that orange tube that we did, that we tracked in the first little bit. And Look Our Way Advertising actually donated this one, and they custom printed spots on it, and they donated it to us for no cost, and that was really great of them. So I wanted to thank them. Thank you for listening.
Turn it on again.
Turn what on again?
What's it doing here?
I can't tell if you're serious or not.
No, it's not. Do it. Turn on the tube. Ask your questions like that.
Okay, so whatever you do.
What?
Immediately afterwards, we're definitely taking this outside and letting it run.
Yeah.
Yes. Other questions? What's up?
Why wasn't the tube man advertising for your tube talk?
You didn't tell me that until now.
I can't just because of the picture. Imagine what people would have been if they saw it outside.
I'd also like to point out there are no PT Cruisers here, so it would have generated an infinite amount of
You should have used a tube man. Put your picture in there. I guess you're at the head, at the top of the tube.
Does anyone have any non-marketing questions? What's up?
I seem to remember you having an animation that looked quite a bit like the data, right?
Well, yeah, but the numbers got lost and I couldn't find them, so it's no more.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that tube has arms, right? And I'm assuming the tube you analyzed didn't have any arms. How would the arm come into play if you were to analyze it differently?
They're hard to model. This one doesn't have arms though, which is kind of nice. They've made us a custom armless tube. I have an idea of how to do it. You can kind of just treat them as random and just add a little driving force to like the 8th pendulum bob, just kind of oscillating. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but it might help knock it over a little bit. You could make the drive stronger so it stays up, and that might knock it over. But there's just a lot of stuff to play with. We just kind of got a working model like 2 weeks ago, and I haven't really had time to dig into playing with stuff like that. But there's a lot of stuff to be done.
It's a good model.
Questions?
I have another one.
Yeah.
Sorry. So,
Okay.
let's say the tube was like rubber. Would like it affect how it's moving, or would it be the same model?
That was kind of our first model actually. Before we had the non-conservative drive, we did it entirely conservative, and the restoring force was based on springs on the inside.
Mhm.
So that's kind of similar to having a rubber tube, but we made it conservative, and I guess you don't have to because you can always add that term on the right side. But
Yeah. Okay. That's cool.